Auctioneer skipped the black bidder every round, until she wrote a number that silenced the entire room. Paddle 47, I see you. Paddle 12, you're in. Paddle 22, still with us. And going once, going twice, sold to Paddle 12 at 1.4 million. The gavel came down hard enough that the sound carried all the way to the back of the room, where Marlene Ashford sat with her numbered paddle resting flat against her knee. She had raised it. She had raised it 3 times during that last lot, and each time the auctioneer's eyes had swept past her like she was part of the wallpaper. Like Paddle 61 did not exist. Like the woman holding it did not exist. The room was full. 200 seats inside the Hargrove auction house, with its coffered ceilings and its crystal pendants catching the afternoon light, and its mahogany walls hung with oil paintings of fox hunts and unnamed English countryside. The kind of room that had been built to communicate, very clearly, who it was built for. A room that had been making that communication every single day since 1937, when Elias Hargrove Sr. had first opened its doors and told his first customers that this was a house of culture, a house of value, a house of discernment. Marlene had been sitting in it for 2 hours. She had not successfully placed a single bid. But here is what the auctioneer standing on that raised platform did not know. Here is what none of the 200 people in that room knew, as they sipped their complimentary sparkling water and adjusted their paddles and studied their catalogs. What they did not know was that the woman in seat G14, the one in the quietly excellent charcoal blazer, with her silver paddle resting against her knee, was not browsing. She was not attending out of curiosity or aspiration, or the particular pleasure of watching other people spend money on beautiful things. She had come to buy a specific item, and she had come with a specific number in mind. And when the time arrived, she was going to write that number down in front of every single person in that room. That number was going to change everything. Before we even get into it, she raised her paddle 3 times and got skipped 3 times? In a room full of people who all saw it? We are going to need to sit with that for a second. Let's get into it. Marlene Ashford grew up on the east side of Durham, North Carolina, in a narrow green house on Dowd Street, where the kitchen faucet dripped in a rhythm her mother had long ago stopped trying to describe to the landlord. The drip had become a kind of clock. It measured the hours her mother, Claudette, spent at the kitchen table after her shift at the hospital laundry, pressing her palms flat against a textbook she had borrowed from the Durham County Public Library branch on South Roxborough. Claudette Ashford was teaching herself accounting, not because she believed she would ever become an accountant, because she believed her daughter might. Marlene did her homework at that same kitchen table, on the other side of the dripping faucet, inside the small circle of light the overhead bulb made when the rest of the house was dark. She was a quiet child who absorbed information the way dry ground absorbs rain, without ceremony, without waste. Her teachers described her in phrases that sounded like compliments and functioned as hedges, very focused, very methodical, unusually deliberate for her age. What they meant was that she did not raise her hand often enough for them to understand how much she knew. The thing Marlene loved from the time she was old enough to understand it as a discrete thing worth loving was value. Not price, not cost, not the number printed on a tag or engraved on a placard. Value, the gap between what something was understood to be worth by the people around it, and what it was actually worth to someone who knew how to look. She found this gap everywhere. In the furniture her grandmother carried out of estate sales in East Durham and sold from the yard on Sundays for 3 times what she had paid. In the baseball cards she traded at school, studying the print runs and the condition grades before anyone else knew what print runs meant. In the way certain houses on certain blocks held their value across decades while the houses next to them did not, and the way almost nobody who lived there could explain why. Claudette noticed. When Marlene was 13, she brought home a slim book from the library, blue cloth cover, worn at the corners, titled The Principles of Art Auction. She set it on the kitchen table next to Marlene's homework and said nothing. She did not say your future is in this book. She did not say this is what you will do with your life. She pressed one hand flat against the cover for a moment, the way she pressed her palms against her accounting textbooks, and then she went to start dinner. Marlene read it in 3 sittings. She understood, immediately and completely, that the auction house was a machine designed to generate a specific illusion. It was designed to make the buyer believe that the number they were paying was the number the object deserved, arrived at through competition and expertise, and the mysterious consensus of the room. The machine was elegant. It was also, if you understood how it worked, remarkably exploitable. Because the machine's fundamental premise, that every bidder in the room had equal access to the bidding process, was not a truth. It was a convention. And conventions, Marlene had already learned, had exceptions that most people never thought to look for. She attended her first real auction at 16, a small estate sale at a church fellowship hall in Chapel Hill. She stood in the back with $12 in her pocket, watching. She did not bid. She watched the auctioneer's eyes. She watched the cadence of his speech. She watched the paddle numbers called, and the paddle numbers skipped, and the paddle numbers called again. And she began to understand, with a precision that would have surprised everyone in that room, the specific grammar of how an auction house decided who was worth acknowledging. By 22, she had a degree in finance from North Carolina Central University and a job at a small investment advisory firm in Raleigh. By 28, she had her own firm. By 34, she had moved her mother, Claudette, out of the house on Dowd Street and into a brick colonial on the west side of Durham with a kitchen faucet that had never once dripped. By 41, Marlene Ashford managed $47 million in client assets, held a fellowship at the Duke Center for Financial Markets, specialized in tangible asset acquisition, meaning real property, fine art, and collectibles, and had walked through the doors of auction houses from New York to London to Hong Kong without once sitting in the back of the room, until today. Today, for reasons that were going to become entirely clear before the afternoon was finished, she was in seat G14, and she was not raising her paddle again until the right moment. The Hargrove Auction House had occupied its building on Tryon Street in Charlotte since 1937. It had passed from Elias Hargrove Sr. to his son Elias Jr., and then to the current director, a man named Preston Hargrove, who had Preston's father's jawline and his grandfather's certainty that certain kinds of people belonged in certain kinds of rooms. Preston ran the house with the relaxed authority of someone who had never been told no by anyone he was required to listen to. He wore a blue tie every auction day, white cuffs, a watch that he rotated on his wrist when he was impatient, which was often. The auctioneer on the platform was a man named Graham Cole. Graham had worked for Hargrove for 11 years. He was good at the technical work, the chant, the rhythm, the controlled escalation of bids. He was also good at something else, something less formal, something that had never been written into his job description, but that Preston Hargrove rewarded quietly and consistently. He was good at reading the room. Specifically, he was good at reading the room and deciding, in real time, which parts of the room merited his attention, and which parts he could politely, professionally, invisibly decline. The catalog for today's auction included 42 lots. The marquee item was Lot 37, a collection of 14 letters written between 1920 and 1936 by the artist Henry Ossawa Tanner to a fellow painter in Philadelphia. The letters had been in a private collection for 60 years. They had been authenticated by two separate institutions. The pre-sale estimate, printed in bold in the catalog, was $300,000 to $450,000. Marlene had read the pre-sale estimate. She had also done her own research, which had taken her 11 weeks, and had involved conversations with 4 art historians, 2 Tanner scholars, a manuscript preservation specialist in Washington, and a collector in Paris who had once owned 3 of the 14 letters before selling them as part of a lot that ended up in the private collection, now being dispersed. Her research had led her to a conclusion that differed meaningfully from the pre-sale estimate. Her conclusion was that the letters, offered together as a complete run for the first time in 6 decades, and offered at exactly this moment in the market for Black American modernist works, were worth considerably more than $450,000. She had come prepared to pay for what she knew. The first 2 hours of the auction moved through lots 1 to 31. Marlene sat in seat G14 with her catalog open on her lap and her paddle resting flat. She watched Graham Cole work the room. She watched the way his eyes moved, left section, front rows, right side. The telephone bidders whose names a woman named Carol read to him from a bank of phones along the side wall. She watched which paddles he acknowledged before they were raised, anticipating the repeat bidders he recognized. She watched which paddles he missed, or appeared to miss, or chose to miss. She raised her paddle in lot 14. A small oil study, not the kind of thing she was particularly interested in, just to establish whether she was visible to the room. Graham Cole's eyes passed over her. He called paddle 12 and paddle 44 and paddle 8. He did not call 61. She lowered her paddle after the lot closed. She raised it again during lot 20. A set of early maps, also not her primary interest. Same result. Graham's eyes swept the room in the same pattern. Left section, front rows, right side, telephone bidders. She was in the middle section. Her paddle was raised at the correct angle. The woman 3 seats to her left, white, approximately her age, in a pale green blazer, raised hers at a lower angle and was acknowledged in 12 seconds. Marlene lowered her paddle. She opened her catalog to lot 37 and placed one finger on the description without pressing down. During lot 28, a man seated 2 rows behind her leaned forward and said, in a voice quiet enough to seem polite and loud enough to be heard by the 4 people around him, "You know, the paddle is supposed to go up when you want to bid, not when you're stretching." There was a small ripple of laughter. Marlene did not turn around. Her hand, resting on her catalog, pressed the page once and released it. The lot closed at 9,400. 2 paddles, neither of them hers. "Nah, I need you to understand what just happened." She raised her paddle during multiple lots. She was deliberately skipped, and then the man behind her tried to make a joke out of it in front of the whole room, and she sat there. She did not move, she did not respond. You need to pay attention to why she did not respond. Keep watching. Lot 37 came up at 3:47 in the afternoon. Graham Cole introduced it with the particular gravity that auction houses reserve for their marquee offerings. He described the provenance. He described the authentication process. He described the significance of Henry Ossawa Tanner as the first internationally recognized African-American artist and the first to establish a sustained European career. And he said all of this in the smooth, professionally appreciative tone of a man reciting facts he had been asked to memorize rather than a man who had felt anything on encountering them. The letters, he said, represented a unique opportunity, a complete run, a 40-year gap since any Tanner correspondence had come to market. He opened at 200,000. The first minute of bidding was orderly. Paddles from the left section, paddle 12 and paddle 33, and a telephone bidder Carol identified as Chicago. The number moved through 250, 275, 300,000. Graham's rhythm quickened at 325. Paddle 12 dropped at 350. Telephone Chicago stayed. Paddle 33 stayed. A new paddle, paddle 44 from the right section, entered at 360. Marlene raised paddle 61. Graham Cole's eyes swept the room. Left section, front row, right side, telephone Carol. He called 33 and 44 and telephoned Chicago. He did not call 61. Marlene kept her paddle raised. The room moved to 380. Paddle 33 dropped. Paddle 44 at 390. Chicago at 400. Marlene's paddle was still in the air. Graham Cole did not look at her. A woman seated directly in front of Marlene, paddle 22, who had been an active bidder throughout the afternoon, turned her head and looked at Marlene's raised paddle, and then looked at Graham Cole and then looked back at Marlene with an expression that was not cruelty and was not kindness, and was simply the face of someone watching something they had already decided was not their problem. She turned back to face the platform, 410 from paddle 44. Chicago at 420. Marlene's arm had been raised for 4 minutes now. The shoulder of her blazer was precisely level with the shoulders of everyone around her. She was not performing. She was simply present, holding a numbered paddle in the air, waiting to be permitted to participate in a transaction she had spent 11 weeks preparing for. Graham Cole brought his gavel up. Going once at 420,000 to our Chicago bidder. Going twice. From the back of the room, a voice said, "Sir." It was not loud. It did not have to be loud, because the room had gone to that particular pre-gavel quiet that auction rooms go to in the last seconds before a lot closes. The voice was calm. It was professional. It was the voice of a woman named Dr. Simone Okafor. And the reason it was calm was that Simone Okafor had been a professor of art history at Duke University for 16 years, had published 4 books on Black American modernism, had served as a consulting authenticator for Christie's, Sotheby's, and 3 private collections of note. and was, incidentally, one of the two scholars whose authentication had been cited in the Lot 37 catalog entry that Graham Cole had just finished reading from the platform. "Sir," Dr. Okafor said again, standing from her seat in row L. "That bidder has had her paddle raised for 4.5 minutes. The room turned. 200 heads, or most of them, shifted toward the middle section of the room, toward seat G14, toward Marlene Ashford, who was still holding paddle 61 in the air with the steadiness of someone who had decided, before she walked through the door of this building, that she was not going to put it down until she was either acknowledged or ignored in front of everyone." Graham Cole looked at Marlene. There was a pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds in that room, in that silence, was a long time. "Paddle 61, he said. His voice had changed in some way that could not be identified precisely, but could be felt by everyone in the room. 420,000 is the current bid. Marlene lowered her paddle. She reached into the slim leather folio on her seat beside her. She withdrew a single folded card, ivory stock, the kind used for correspondence, not for auction registration. She unfolded it. On the inside, in her own handwriting, was a single number. She held the card up, facing the platform, so that Graham Cole could read it. So that the rows in front of her, who had turned to look, could read it. So that the room could read it. The number was $850,000. The silence in the room changed quality. It went from the silence of interruption to the silence of comprehension, the silence that descends when a room is processing something it did not expect to have to process. Preston Hargrove, who was standing at the side of the room near a pillar he typically used as his observation post, pushed off the pillar. He took 3 steps toward the platform and stopped. His hand went to his watch. He rotated it once on his wrist. Graham Cole said, "Paddle 61 bids $850,000. He said it clearly. He said it into the microphone on the podium. The number moved through the room like a change in air pressure. Telephone Carol said something quietly into her headset. A pause. She shook her head at Graham, which meant Chicago was done. Paddle 44 had already gone still. "Going once," Graham Cole said, "at $850,000. He looked at the room. The room looked back. "Going twice." He picked up his gavel. He looked at it for a moment in a way that seemed slightly longer than the routine motion required. Then he brought it down. "Sold. To paddle 61, $850,000. Hold on. She wrote a number on a card. And silenced an entire room that had been ignoring her for 2 hours. "I need a minute. I really need a minute. Let's keep going because we are not even at the best part yet." The transaction processing period at Hargrove Auction House took place in a private office to the left of the main room. Preston Hargrove arrived at the door of that office while Marlene was still in her seat waiting for the lot to be formally noted by the records staff. He arrived with the particular kind of composure that men like Preston Hargrove deploy when something has happened that requires composure to manage, the composed face of a man recalculating. He sat down in the empty seat beside her, not in front of her. Beside her, which was a choice, the kind of choice that implies informality. That implies the person making it believes the setting to be one where informality is appropriate and available to them. He said that they certainly appreciated spirited bidding, that the Tanner collection was an extraordinary piece of cultural history, that they were delighted it would go to someone who clearly understood its significance. Marlene looked at the catalog in her lap. "I'll need the authentication certificates transferred to my name within 48 hours, she said. "I'll also need the condition report for each of the 14 letters, the storage specifications from the previous owner, and the full provenance chain going back to the original collector in 1936. She turned a page. "I'll email the format requirements to your records office." Preston Hargrove said, slowly, that he wanted to address something. He wanted to address the, as he phrased it, irregularity in the bidding process. He said that Graham was a very experienced auctioneer, that large rooms with high lot counts created certain challenges in visibility and acknowledgement, that the house took pride in its commitment to, as he phrased it, inclusivity and access for all bidders. Marlene folded her catalog. She looked at him for the first time since he had sat down. "Hargrove," she said, "I raised my paddle during lot 14. I raised it during lot 20. I raised it at the opening of lot 37. and I held it in the air for 4 minutes and 31 seconds, while your auctioneer called every other active paddle in the room. I am a registered bidder with a valid paddle issued by your registration desk. The chair directly in front of me witnessed the Lot 37 situation and chose not to speak. Your auctioneer had to be called out by a guest not affiliated with my party before he acknowledged me. She set the catalog on the seat beside her. What I need from you is not an explanation. What I need from you are the documentation items I just listed. Preston Hargrove looked at his watch. He rotated it once on his wrist. He said that he understood. He said that he would personally ensure the documentation was prepared. He said that he hoped she would continue to regard Hargrove as a resource for future acquisitions. She did not respond to that. What Preston Hargrove did not know, as he sat in that seat constructing his careful sentences, was that 3 things had been occurring in the main room while he was having this conversation. The first was that Dr. Simone Okafor, who had called out the auctioneer from row L, was speaking with 2 journalists who had been credentialed to cover the auction for an arts and culture publication. The second was that a man named Marcus Webb, who was a compliance attorney and who had attended the auction as a guest of a collector friend, had already written down the lot numbers, approximate times, and the specific sequence of events during Lot 37 in the notes application of his phone. The third was that a woman named Deja Fountain, who was 23 years old and had been hired 6 months ago as the house's junior digital media coordinator, had been operating a live video feed for the Hargrove social media accounts during the auction. Deja had been watching the room. Deja had her own notes. The piece published 4 days later in Architectural and Arts Digest was not long. It did not need to be long. The journalist who wrote it had been in the room. She described what she had observed in 3 tight paragraphs. The repeated failure to acknowledge a registered bidder across multiple lots. The bidder's sustained patience. The intervention of Dr. Okafor from row L. The eventual acknowledgement. The closing bid of $850,000. More than twice the high presale estimate by the bidder who had been ignored. She named Graham Cole. She named Preston Hargrove. She named Hargrove Auction House. She named Marlene Ashford by title. Principal Ashford Tangible Asset Management. Durham, North Carolina, Duke University Fellow. The article was shared 11,000 times in 72 hours. Marcus Webb had, in the meantime, filed a formal complaint with the North Carolina Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, attaching his contemporaneous notes in a signed statement. Dr. Okafor had provided a statement as well. 3 other attendees, none of them known to Marlene or to each other, had submitted written accounts to the same complaint. Deja Fountain had done something else. She had gone to the house's own archived social media footage, the live video she had been operating, and had clipped the 17-minute sequence, beginning with Lot 37's opening bid and ending with the gavel coming down at 8:50. The clip was 4 minutes and 32 seconds long. It showed Marlene's paddle in the air from the 3rd angle clearly. It showed Graham Cole's eyes moving around the room. It showed the trajectory of his acknowledgments. It showed Dr. Okafor standing. It showed the card being raised. It showed the room's silence. Deja had sent the clip to the Arts Digest journalist before the article was filed. She had also sent it to 3 other outlets. The clip had 400,000 views by the end of the first week. Graham Cole did not comment publicly. His 11-year employment at Hargrove Auction House ended by mutual agreement 12 days after the auction. The language in the Hargrove public statement used the phrase "parted ways" and did not elaborate, which was a choice that satisfied no one and clarified nothing, and was, in this regard, precisely representative of the choice it replaced. Preston Hargrove was required, under the terms of a settlement agreement negotiated over the following 8 weeks between Hargrove's legal team and Marcus Webb's firm, to issue a public statement. The statement went through 7 drafts. In the final version, which was read by Preston Hargrove at a brief press availability in the Hargrove lobby in front of 6 cameras and approximately 40 people, he acknowledged that the bidding process during the October auction had been inadequate. He acknowledged that Paddle 61 had not received proper acknowledgement consistent with House protocol. He described Ms. Ashford, and his voice held the particular flatness of a man reading a word he would not have chosen, as a serious and committed participant in the fine art market. He said the house was committed to equitable access for all registered bidders. A reporter asked him if he believed what had happened was deliberate. He said he could not speak to the internal thinking of any individual staff member. The reporter asked him if he intended to apologize directly to Ms. Ashford. He looked at the statement in his hand and said, "We regret that the experience did not reflect the standard of service this house aims to provide." The reporters wrote down what he said. 3 of them also wrote down what he did not say. What Preston Hargrove also did not know, on the day of the auction, was the specific nature of what Marlene intended to do with the Tanner letters. She did not keep them for her own collection. She had never intended to. She had told this to Dr. Okafor during one of their 4 conversations in the 11 weeks before the auction, the conversations in which they had discussed the letters' scholarly significance, their authentication history, and the specific question of where they should properly live. They had agreed on an answer to that question before the auction date. The Henry Osawa Tanner letters were donated, in their entirety, to the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, with a restricted gift that funded a permanent reading room in the name of Claudette Ashford, Marlene's mother, for the preservation and study of correspondence by Black American artists of the early 20th century. The deed of gift was announced in a joint press release by Marlene's firm and the museum 5 weeks after the auction closed. The museum's director said, "The collection filled a documented gap in their holdings." She said the reading room would be a resource for scholars for generations. She said the naming was exactly right. Claudette Ashford, who was 71 years old and had driven up from Durham with her sister to attend the announcement, was sitting in the front row of the museum's reception gallery when the director said those words. She was wearing a gray dress and her good earrings, and she had her hands folded in her lap, and when the director said the naming was exactly right, Claudette pressed both hands against her chest and held them there, and her eyes went full and still, and she did not wipe them. She let them run. She had waited long enough for this room. She was going to let herself feel it completely. Marlene, standing at the podium, looked at her mother and said nothing for a moment. Then she turned back to the room. "My mother taught me that the value of a thing is not determined by who is standing closest to it," she said. "It is determined by who is willing to understand it." These letters have always been exactly what they are. The room they are in now has finally caught up. The civil rights complaint, filed by Marcus Webb's firm, was joined by 2 other complainants in the months following, both of them black bidders, who had attended Hargrove auctions in prior years and who had observed similar patterns of paddle acknowledgement. The joint complaint resulted in a formal investigation by the North Carolina Department of Justice that extended over 14 months. At the conclusion of that investigation, Hargrove Auction House entered into a consent decree requiring independent auditing of its bidding process, mandatory staff training on equitable bidding practices, and the appointment of an independent monitor for a period of 3 years. The consent decree was public record. Graham Cole relocated to an auction consulting role at a regional house in Virginia. His name appeared in the consent decree as the auctioneer of record on the date in question. It was not redacted. Deja Fountain, the 23-year-old digital media coordinator, who had sent the clip to the journalists, was recognized in the press coverage of the investigation's conclusion. She had by that time left Hargrove Auction House. She had been accepted to a master's program in nonprofit arts administration at UNC Chapel Hill, with a fellowship funded through a grant administered by Ashford Tangible Asset Management. Preston Hargrove retained his title as director of Hargrove Auction House. He retained the blue tie. He retained the watch he rotated on his wrist when he was impatient. What he did not retain, over the 3 years of the consent decree, was the fiction that the room he presided over was a room of neutral, meritocratic transaction. That fiction had been dismantled on the record, in the presence of witnesses, and would remain dismantled. Marlene attended one more Hargrove auction during the consent decree period, 2 years after the Tanner lot. She sat in the center of the room. She registered with paddle 19. When she raised it, it was acknowledged in under 30 seconds. She bid on 2 lots. She won one of them, a small bronze sculpture, early 20th century, by a name most of the room did not recognize. She knew what it was worth. 3 years later, the reading room bearing Claudette Ashford's name at the Museum of the African Diaspora had hosted 11 research residencies, welcomed 432 visiting scholars, and been written about in 7 academic publications. The Tanner letters had been fully digitized and were accessible through the museum's online archive to anyone in the world who wanted to read them. In the small town of Dowd Street in East Durham, in the house where Marlene had done her homework under a single overhead bulb, a new family was living now. The kitchen faucet no longer dripped. A previous owner had fixed it years ago, on the day she moved her mother out. The library on South Roxborough still had the blue cloth book, The Principles of Art Auction, on a shelf in the reference section. The spine was worn. The pages were marked in pencil by at least 3 readers, whose names were not written anywhere in it. One of those sets of pencil marks, in the chapter on bidding psychology, next to a paragraph about the auctioneer's discretionary authority in acknowledging paddles, was smaller and more precise than the others. The margin note next to it reads simply, "This is the gap, the value of a thing. The gap between what it is understood to be and what it actually is, by someone who knows how to look." Marlene Ashford had understood that gap when she was 16 years old, standing in the back of a fellowship hall in Chapel Hill with $12 in her pocket, watching an auctioneer's eyes. She had spent the next 25 years learning exactly what to do with that understanding, and when the moment came, when she sat in seat G14, with paddle 61, held in the air for 4 minutes and 32 seconds while a room full of people made their choices, she did not snap. She did not raise her voice. She wrote a number on a card. The number said everything that needed to be said. It said it in the only language that room had ever been designed to hear. "Yo, I need to say something directly to you right now. This story is fictional. Marlene is not a real person. Hargrove Auction House is not a real place. But what happened in that room? That experience of raising your hand and being looked through? Of sitting in a space that was built to communicate you don't belong here? Of having to be twice as prepared, twice as patient, twice as certain before anyone in the room takes you seriously? That is not fictional. That is a Tuesday for a lot of people watching this right now. And the fact that it took a woman writing a number on a card, a number that turned out to be more than twice what anyone in that room expected, for the auctioneer to finally acknowledge her. That part hits differently when you've lived something like it. So here's my question for you. Has there ever been a room in your life, a professional room, a social room, a literal room, where you felt like your hand was raised and nobody was looking? Drop it in the comments. I want to know. Because I think a lot of us have been sitting in that chair, and a lot of us have been waiting for permission to write our number down. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Long, real, and built to make you feel something that lasts. Leave a comment. Tell me where your Marlene moment was. We are reading every single one.